Hello again. This is a video where I'm going to introduce you to the subfield of comparative politics. Now, comparative politics is one of the four major subfields in political science as it's studied in American universities. The others are international relations, American politics, and political theory. So what is comparative politics? Well, put briefly and broadly, comparative politics is the study of the domestic politics of other countries. Why would we study the domestic politics of other countries? Well, many reasons, but at least one reason is to better understand how they have tried to solve problems that we also face. The problems of providing roads and infrastructure, healthcare, and other public goods, as well as the problems of trying to limit the political power of those who are too powerful or too rich, the problems of trying to secure justice for those who are weak or poor, the problems of organizing representation for different social classes, different professions, different ethnic groups, different religions, and so on and so forth. These are problems that many countries, if not all countries, face, and all of them try to solve these problems in different ways. And so the nice thing about comparative politics is it can provide a real window on our own political life by looking at how other people have done things. And perhaps we can learn from them. Perhaps sometimes it's they who can learn from us. So there are five basic subfields within comparative politics. These are obviously somewhat interrelated, and certainly I could have picked more, but five is a nice round sort of number. First, we're going to talk a little bit about political development. Political development is the process through which modern nations and states arise and how political institutions and regimes evolve. So just like in economics, you have economic development where countries get richer, and they get richer largely by making better use of existing assets or acquiring more assets somehow. Political development is sort of the same thing. How do we more cheaply solve problems or extend solutions to problems to more people? And the key words in the field of political development include things like, what does it mean to be modern? What counts as a nation? What counts as a state? What counts as a political institution? What counts as a regime? Every field, of academic study has its own vocabulary, its own terms, which people throw around, its own jargon, you might say. And political science and comparative politics is no different. One of the tasks that you're going to have in this course is to start learning the jargon, start learning the words, and for that, again, your textbook is sort of an invaluable resource because your textbook has these words defined. And so I suggest that you familiarize yourselves with them. It'll make your life a little bit easier as I start throwing them around throughout the course. Okay, a second area of study is a study of regime types and change. Now, these are actually two distinct enterprises. The study of regime types is kind of a exercise in typology or classification. We try to put regimes into neat little labels in order to be able to group them up into into regimes that are more similar than different. And of course, no two regimes are exactly alike, but we can hope that certain kinds of democracies, for example, parliamentary democracies, might behave in similar ways, even though some of them are in all different parts of the world. Similarly, we might hope that one-party state dictatorships might behave similarly. We might be able to predict their behavior by looking at what other one-party state dictatorships have been doing in the face of a similar set of circumstances or problems. So we classify regime types in order to be able to compare them, in order to be able to get a better sense of how they tend to behave. Of course, there's going to be some regimes that are unique, that defy classification. The United States is a regime that doesn't really look very similar to any others. India is also another one which is a bit of an outlier, but by and large, countries can be classified fairly easily, and this helps us make better comparisons. The study of regime change is not a question of classification. A study of regime change is a question of cause and effect. It's what you might call the science in political science, and the study of regime change, therefore, is a study by which one regime, like an autocratic one-party state, becomes a democracy, or how communist states transition to democracy after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 to 1991. Many of those Eastern European countries became democracies of different kinds, and of course, the study of that change, about how and why this happened, is of particular interest to comparativists, because many comparativists think that some kinds of regimes are more desirable than others, although that's a question of political theory. And of course, we'd like to know not just how things occur, but also perhaps how to facilitate that occurrence. Okay. Worth noting, in the study of regimes, and we said the regimes were sets of rules, right? Regimes were sets of rules for government that determine who rules and how. Now, some rules are formal, and by formal, I simply mean they're written down and codified into law. You can go look them up. So, electoral rules in the United States, if you want to know what it takes to get elected, what it takes to get on the ballot, all of those rules are codified in state law and state constitutions, and we can go look them up. Other rules are more informal. These are generally known rules, they're generally understood, and they're generally complied with. People obey them, but they're not codified. These include things like political traditions that aren't in the rule books, but nonetheless have considerable predictive power when it comes to figuring out how people are going to behave. So, informal rules, there are countries where the study of the formal rules will tell you remarkably little about what's going on. You have to ask people about what the informal rules are in some ways. Whereas other countries, you look at their constitutions, you look at their laws, and you've got a pretty good idea of how things are going to happen. Okay, there are, looking at the third major area of study in comparative politics, participation and representation. Participation and representation studies how are people included or excluded from the rulemaking process. How do individuals organize themselves into groups for the purpose of exercising political influence? So in the United States, we have a lot of NGOs, we have lobbyists, we have a lot of people, we have voting, we have political parties. These are all ways of including people in the electoral process, of exercising influence over the decision-making process. And so in areas of participation and representation, we study elections, we study political parties, we study interest groups, we study identity groups. Fair enough. Policy making. Well, comparative public policy is really interesting. That's how we figure out how to learn from what other people are doing. Every year around the world, countries innovate. They do things that haven't ever been done before, in the sense that they pass laws that they think will do some good, and comparativists are interested by these changes because they want to evaluate their success, because they might be applicable to other places. So the study of comparative public policy making is pretty interesting, one of the more interesting areas in my opinion. So then the question becomes, well, how is the content of the different rules determined? How does that content vary across countries? How do similar rules apply differently in different countries? You can have the same law in two different sets of institutions, and that law can give you very, very different results in each case. Okay, and finally, political economy. Political economy is the study of the interaction between political and economic phenomena. So, for instance, we want to know which political rules cause which political outcomes, which economic outcomes, So, for example, how does the type of labor rules affect the types of industry that are competitive? But of course, also, which economic variables and processes affect the content of the rules? How does the distribution of wealth in a country affect the kind of regime that it has, or the kinds of political rules that it puts into place? Of course, those are just examples. There's many, many different ways to come at the topic of political economy, but just to note that because economic policymaking is so important to the activities of the modern state, a lot of the comparisons that we make between countries are often comparisons of political economy. So, comparative politics as a subfield of political science has evolved in the past 50 years. If you talk to people in, say, your grandfather's generation, and they took a comparative politics class, what they probably took was an area studies class. That means that scholars would pick an area of the world, like the Middle East, or Northern Africa, or Latin America, or South Asia, or something, and they would specialize in studying the politics of those countries. And so they would frequently travel to those countries, and they would write about developments that were going on in those countries, in a single country or in a single region. But more recently, people become dissatisfied with that approach because people became, very knowledgeable about particular areas of the world, but they essentially weren't able to produce any kind of generalizable knowledge, any kind of generalizable political knowledge that we could say, okay, political systems in general, under specific conditions, behave in a certain way. And so there was a lack of generalizability about this focus on single cases or single regions. And so a lot of people sort of retreated to perhaps an older tradition of making political comparisons between countries and doing so more or less systematically. So if you are a student of the classics, you've read Aristotle's Politics, or Machiavelli's The Prince, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, or even Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, all these are classics of political science in some sense, which doesn't mean that they are necessarily very correct, very true in the knowledge that they develop, but they are classics in the sense that they are early attempts to systematically take lessons from the differences in regime types around countries, in different countries, and then trying to make something of that knowledge. Part of the problems is that the cases that these authors selected were not random. They often cherry-picked, that is to say, they often pick the cases that suit their argument the most and tend to ignore inconvenient examples or inconvenient counterexamples. I see students do this a lot in papers where they have a view that they want to defend, and so they only go and look at literature that supports their view and conveniently ignore all the literature that doesn't support their view. And as a result, their study, of course, finds what they were looking for, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily right. Moreover, this tradition often only compared written laws and constitutions, and of course, if we're trying to figure out where those laws come from or how much influence those laws actually have over the behavior of individuals, then looking merely at the legal texts wasn't going to be sufficient. So today I would say that comparative politics has moved into the area of doing sort of big cross-country studies, right? You survey 37 different countries, or the people in 37 different countries, and you try to compare their answers to similar questions, or you look at the legal systems of many different countries, or you look at certain kinds of political phenomena that are occurring in different countries, like, say, healthcare reform, and then you start taking all the countries that have reformed their healthcare from one system to another, and you see what kinds of lessons that you can draw. In other words, the trend is towards larger cross-country comparisons, and I think that trend is largely driven by access to a more sophisticated methodology, that is to say, more sophisticated statistics and statistical methods, as well as better data. At the end of the day, our sort of globalized world is data intensive. We collect more kinds of data over more kinds of phenomena, political and otherwise, than ever before, and that data is more reliable than it ever was. And so, at the end of the day, we're able to discover more and more through this just accumulation of data, as well as our statistical techniques, our improved statistical techniques. So the hope is that we're going to be able to discover more knowledge and learn a lot more about the world that we live in.